Good evening, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of our 2020 Why We Ride webinar series. Thanks for coming tonight. My name's Eric. I'm the program director here at Bike and Build. And if you're unfamiliar with Bike and Build and what we do, we are a nonprofit organization that organizes cross-country and regional bicycle trips to benefit affordable housing and also empower young adults, our trip participants, to be civically engaged and commit to a lifetime of service. And so typically during the summer, you can find our teams of young adults biking around or across the US, partaking in this adventure and then stopping along the way every 2 to 3 days and volunteering with different affordable housing organizations. And so because of COVID-19, we aren't doing that this summer, but we're hoping to recreate some of that interaction with affordable housing leaders through this weekly webinar series. And we're doing this because affordable housing is a complex cause. It's about so much more than just a home. It's about, it's entwined with education, racial inequity, public health, government lending, transportation, fair wages, zoning laws, and so much more. And so through this series, we're hoping to dive into the nuances of affordable housing, hear from a broad range of speakers who are all working towards a common goal of fair, decent housing for all. So this week, we're excited to hear from Angela McIver from the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania. Her work, she's a national leader and advocate for fair housing for all. And as the CEO for this organization, she works to address the problem of housing discrimination in this whole region here near Philadelphia. So she has about a 30-minute presentation prepared, and we encourage you, the listeners, to pop any questions that you have in the Q&A box as we go. And then we'll also have a short Q&A session towards the end. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and then hand it over to Angela.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and to your audience. I am deeply appreciative of this platform to be able to talk about fair housing, which is my life's passion and work. And I hope that you're able to gain something out of this discussion this evening that helps you understand about why fair housing has been a struggle for this country. So with that in mind, I'm going to dive right into the content. Today's presentation is entitled Fair Housing to the Rescue, From Centuries of Disenfranchisement to Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 as amended. Next. A little bit about the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania. We were organized in 1990 and we incorporated in 1992. Our mission is to ensure equal access to housing opportunities for all persons. And we achieve our mission by educating the public on fair housing laws. We provide legal assistance to individuals who've experienced unlawful housing discrimination. We monitor the community for compliance with applicable housing laws. We work with all government entities to preserve and implement housing laws. And we offer information and referral on housing-related issues. Our services include education outreach, testing investigations, complaint reception and resolution, advocacy, consultancy, and information and referral. Next. Today, here's what we're going to learn. Now, I know it's a long list and it looks like quite a bit, and it really is, and it's a lot to get through in the next few minutes, but I want to preface it by saying I want to be very respectful to everyone who's participating in this webinar, because I'm going to address a number of sensitive topics. We're talking about the history of the United States, which means it has not all been comforting, it has not all been easy. In fact, there are points that are extremely difficult to bear with. There's also language in here that may be uncomfortable to our listeners and viewers, so I apologize in advance for that, but it's a history lesson, so please bear with me. We're going to talk about how did we get here, a review of policies that disenfranchised African Americans, a review of legal forms of conditional enfranchisement, a look at the period of so-called freedom, marginalization during the pre- and post-civil rights movement, history of fair housing, what housing discrimination is, examples of housing discrimination, who are the protected classes, why is it important, race and fair lending discrimination, what revealed from the Center for Investigative Reporting uncovered about modern day redlining, what can we do to address redlining, segregation, and gentrification, effects of housing discrimination, filing a fair housing or fair lending complaint, press releases, and of course, thank you. Next. How did we get here? please take in the images of this marginalized area. Believe it or not, this is all from the 19132 zip code here in the city of Philadelphia, which is known as the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, but it's also known as the largest, poorest city in America. In fact, there's a list of top 10 poor neighborhoods in the city of Philadelphia, and 3 of those neighborhoods are located in the 19132 zip code, and you're looking at images of such. Next. It's important to note that a sequence of events and centuries of disenfranchisement against African Americans occurred. So we're going to start with 1619, and I'm going to adjust something on my end. There we go. 1619, 20 African slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. Like indentured servants, the slaves were probably freed after a fixed period of service. In 1638, the doctrine of exclusion states the following: neither the existing Black population, their descendants, nor any other Blacks shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. In 1641, Massachusetts is the first colony to legalize slavery. From 1641 to 1681, anti-miscegenation laws were enacted. Those laws were based on false racial concept of white people that were invented as a matter of law in America, which gave birth to white supremacy. Those laws prohibited a person of African descent from voting, owning a gun, and taking legal action against white people. Whites turned Africans into false racial constructs, including Negroes, and I'll just say the N-word. In 1669, anti-miscegenation laws ushered in the Casual Killing Act, which declared it illegal to kill a slave while correcting because malice could not be presumed. From 1676 to 1677, Bacon's Rebellion was an armed rebellion that occurred in Virginia, in which a divide and conquer strategy was crafted to separate ethnic groups by skin color. In 1682, Virginia declares that all imported Black servants are slaves for life. In 1700, Pennsylvania legalizes slavery. In 1711, Pennsylvania prohibits the importation of Black and Indian slaves. Next. There's more about disenfranchisement against African Americans. In 1770, escaped slave Crispin Attucks was killed by British forces in Boston, Massachusetts. He's one of the first colonists to die in the War for Independence. In 1775, the slave population in the colonies is nearly 500,000. In Virginia, the ratio of free colonists to slaves is nearly 1-to-1, and in South Carolina, it's approximately 1-to-2. In 1775, Anthony Benezet of Philadelphia founds the world's first abolitionist society. In 1776, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, members of the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence. In 1780, Pennsylvania begins gradual emancipation. In 1780, the Freedom Clause in the Massachusetts Constitution is interpreted as the abolishment of slavery. Massachusetts enfranchises all men regardless of race. In 1783, American Revolution ends. Britain and the infant United States sign the Peace of Paris Treaty. In 1793, under the Fugitive Slave Act, the United States outlaws any efforts to impede the capture of runaway slaves. In 1820, because of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri is admitted to the Union as a slave state. Maine is a free state. Slavery is forbidden in any subsequent territories north of latitude 36 degree, 30 minus. Next, please. More about disenfranchisement against African Americans. In 1847, escaped slave Frederick Douglass begins publishing the North Star in Rochester, New York. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escapes after fleeing slavery, and she returns south at least 15 times to help rescue several hundred others. In 1857, in the Dred Scott case, The Supreme Court of the United States decides 7-2 that Blacks can never be citizens and that Congress has no authority to outlaw slavery in any territory. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois becomes the first Republican to win the United States presidency. In 1860, Southern secession occurs when South Carolina succeeds in December. More states follow the next year. From 1861 to 1865, the United States Civil War ensues and claims 623,000 lives. Next. Now we have legal forms of conditional enfranchisement. In 1863, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which decrees that all slaves in rebel territory are free on January 1st, 1863. In 1865, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment of a crime. From 1865 to 1877, Reconstruction is the period of after the Civil War that was planned by Abraham Lincoln. In part, Reconstruction was meant to redress the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy, and to solve the problems arising from the readmission to the Union of the 11 states that seceded, but Reconstruction was undermined. The planters and everyone who benefited from the enterprise of slavery felt cheated, shortchanged, and wholeheartedly believed the wrong side lost the war. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was enacted to ensure that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws. In 1866, Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee, organized the 19th Century Klan as a social club. The organization quickly became a vehicle of Southern white underground resistance to Reconstruction, restoration of white supremacy, and violence against newly enfranchised Black freemen. In 1870, the 15th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Next. New forms of anti-miscegenation during the period of so-called freedom. So we have during the mid-1860s, slave codes that were really the forerunners of Black codes, which were adopted by Midwestern states to relegate or inhibit the migration of free African Americans to the Midwest. Jim Crow was enacted after the period of Reconstruction. It refers to a series of racist state and local laws and measures that were discriminatory and imposed segregation against African Americans in the Southern United States. The laws mandated de jure segregation in all public facilities in states of the former Confederate States of America, starting with the separate but equal and restricting movement and knowing one's place were few effects of Jim Crow. However, those laws were also intended to restrict the autonomy of African Americans in order to force them to work in a labor economy. From 1882 to 1968, lynching in America occurred in part because Black codes were valued and policed for outputs that grew wealth. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson was the landmark Supreme Court of the United States decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. In 1917, Buchanan versus Warley was a Supreme Court of the United States decision that struck down racial zoning laws, but in its place, racial covenants became a popular tool that essentially did the same thing. In 1934, under President FDR Roosevelt, the Federal Housing Administration was created to help usher in a new generation of homeowners. Once again, Blacks were excluded. One of the most infamous outcomes of the Roosevelt administration were the Homeowner Loan Corporation, also known as HULC redlining maps, that included a legend or grading system that went like this: green or A, also known as first grade or best; B or blue, which is also second grade or still desirable; yellow or C, also known as third grade or declining; and red or D, which was fourth grade, also known as hazardous and sometimes known as risky or dangerous. And I truly believe that not only did the shading describe the area, but it was really meant to describe the people that were living in the area, which became a dog whistle for things like, oh, there goes the neighborhood. Next. Marginalization ensued during the pre and post civil rights movement. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark Supreme Court of the United States decision in which justices ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. The decision was also a cornerstone of the civil rights movement and helped establish the precedent that separate but equal education and other services were not, in fact, equal at all. In 1955, Rosa Louise Macaulay Parks wearily refused to relinquish her seat on a bus to a white man. She was arrested, fingerprinted, and incarcerated. When Parks agreed to have her case contested, it became a cause célèbre in the fight against Jim Crow. Again in 1955, Emmett Lewis Till was a 14-year-old African-American who was lynched in Mississippi after being accused of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store. And then again in 1955, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as one of the most visible spokesperson and leader of the civil rights movement. In 1964, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were three men of the civil rights movement who were murdered. Cheney's murder, that consisted of torture, chain whipping, and shooting, contributed to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then between 1966 and 1967, Dr. King moved to Chicago to serve as the nation's first tester in housing. He worked with President Johnson to achieve housing fairness rights and would redress redlining and other harm that negatively impacted African Americans who were forced into residential racial segregation. Next. Now we're moving into the history of the Fair Housing Act. Must take a moment to just talk about April 4th, 1968. We know that on that date at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King entered onto the balcony and was assassinated. Immediately following Dr. King's assassination, the outrage from people who viewed Dr. King as the prince or prophet of nonviolence who was murdered resulted in 125 cities burning around the country. And it had a lot to do with the hope and that was suddenly taken away and the despair that people felt. However, by April 11th, 1968, due to President Johnson and several others, he was able to help our Congress garner enough votes in order to pass the Fair Housing Act, which is also known as 42 United States Code 3601 through 3619, or Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 as amended. In 1968, the law prohibited discriminatory practices in housing with regards to most housing transactions, including sales, rental, financing based on race, religion, color, and national origin. It's really important to note that gender was not added to the law until 1974, until we had the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And then in 1988, the Fair Housing Act was significantly strengthened by giving Congress and the Department of Justice authority over the act, and two additional protections were added: disability and familial status. Next. We have some visuals. Okay. Great. Housing discrimination. What is it? It's treating a person or group of people differently. It's important to note right now that under this presidential administration, a lot has been done to raise awareness around sexual harassment in housing. So if you are the victim of sexual harassment in housing, whether it's quid pro quo, you know, something for something, or a hostile environment, you have the right to complain. You can complain directly to HUD. You can complain to an agency like the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania. And if that complaint rises to a certain level, like a pattern or practice of sexual harassment, then the Department of Justice will step in. Next. There are different forms of housing discrimination that you should be aware of. Now, this list isn't inclusive of all forms of housing discrimination, but there are a few that's pretty popular. For example, intentional, you know, we can't rent to you. Or disparate impact, meaning a neutral policy on its face when applied has a harsher effect on protected classes. Here's how that looks in practice. Our policy begins with a minimum loan amount of $60,000. Okay, so what if it's $55,000? Then you're excluded. Steering. I know the perfect neighborhood for you. That's very common. In fact, that happened to me several decades ago. I was in University City in Philadelphia looking for housing because I really liked University City. I stopped in a realtor's office and inquired about housing in that area. He looked at me and said, I know the perfect neighborhood for you. And instead, he asked me to follow him out of University City into an extremely marginalized community in Philadelphia. I had no way of knowing at the time that that was called steering, but I can tell you I felt terrible when that happened. Next, refusal to allow reasonable accommodations or reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities. In other words, that looks like you can't have a service dog here, or you have to pay the pet fee. HUD has issued guidance and has amended the guidance on service dogs, emotional support animals, animals that are not pets, but animals that perform a service because they mitigate a disability. And if you qualify for that kind of animal because it's performing a job, then you should definitely make the request for reasonable accommodation. And if you are denied, you should complain about that. And then last but not least, for the sake of illustration, we have design and construction features, and they are meant to ensure accessibility requirements. And here's an example of what it might look like when someone is being denied design and construction. Our homeowners association voted against installing ramps here. Listen, if you're a person with a disability, you have a child with a disability, you didn't start out with a disability, but you become disabled along the way in your housing and you need a ramp or you need any kind of modification to your home, you have the right to make that request. And the housing provider or a homeowners association doesn't have the right to deny it on its face. They must engage in what's called the interactive process and determine if it will create an administrative and financial burden. If that's not the case, then it is very likely that the answer should be yes. Next. Here are some examples of what protected classes look like. I noticed that for religion and familial status, my visuals aren't there. I don't know what happened to them, but oh, bingo. Race, you see there people from the made up construct of race, but you know, the word has been with us for so long, it kind of works visually. Color is there because sometimes people are one thing, but they're perceived as being something else. And that's the case of Congressman Butterfield that is on the page. And then religion, you just see all of this interfaith religion in front of you, national origin, gender, it doesn't have to be female, it could be male. And then we know we have non-binary and we have familial status. There's the baby bump there because it could represent the baby bump. It could represent a single mother, a single father, large families. It's families with children under age 18, expected parents, foster parents, and such. And then there's disability, which can be physical or mental impairment. Next. It's really important to identify in your state or locality if there are any additional protections. So let's look at Pennsylvania for a moment. Pennsylvania's protections mirror the federal protections, but you get a bonus. So in addition to race, color, gender, religion, national origin, familial status, disability, if you're 40 or older in Pennsylvania, you also have that protection. Philadelphia has more protections than we have at the federal and state level. So if you experience discrimination in Philadelphia on the basis of source of income, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, domestic violence, you have the right to file a complaint with the municipality, but you won't be able to do so at the state or federal level unless guidance has been written by HUD and the guidance matches what is available at the local level. So let me put a little context around that. Sexual orientation. If you believe that because of your sexual orientation, gender identity, or domestic violence, you are being denied housing, it is possible to couch that under race. So under the protection of race, you may be able to use the federal law to address that issue. And you'll see towards the end of this presentation, the organization was able to do that for someone that's in a press release. So always check in each locality to find out if there are additional fair housing protections. Next. Okay. Why is this important? We can advance. Well, this is important because the percent of complaints by protected classes does vary. And it's pretty obvious from this visual that disability exceeds all of the complaints that are filed. And it's not just once, you know, it's been for decades now. People with disabilities have really been the top group to file complaints and to assert their fair housing rights. Now, it's misleading. It doesn't mean that the numbers are wrong. The numbers are right in terms of the people who complained. So what you're seeing is a reflection of the number of people that actually filed complaints. But it's important to note that all representation is underreporting because not everybody complained. Let's look at race as an example. You see that 19% appears here by race. That does not mean that there was only 19% of discrimination in the United States on the basis of race. Rather, it is extremely underreported, and there are reasons why it's underreported. Number one, people get tired of dealing with race. Let me repeat that. People get tired of dealing with race. They are fatigued. In fact, there is a term, racial battle fatigue, that many people say that they are dealing with. Aside from the fatigue, there's been a very interesting way in which our society has started to deal with race, and that is to say the first person who mentions it is the problem. That's happened to yours truly. I've been told that I'm the racist because I brought up the issue, because my work is to educate people about this unfortunate issue. Since I brought it up, it's my fault. That's some kind of, you know, reverse psychology. I get that, and I could care less about that. What I want to do is live in a world in which people no longer are condemned because of the color of their skin. They're no longer condemned because of their disability, because of their gender, because of their religion, because of their national origin, because of their color, because they have families with children, and so forth. Next. Race discrimination. I'm going to say a little more about this because it is important to understand that discrimination studies that discrimination based upon race occur nationally about 3.7 million times per year, or 1 in every 4 transactions. Again, it goes underreported. People get tired of it. They don't want to become the scapegoat. Next. Lending discrimination. I decided to go with lending discrimination because redlining really is the basis for this particular presentation. It's important to note that the Fair Housing Act is the broadest and strongest piece of civil rights legislation that we have in this country, yet it's the least known and used. And redlining sounds like something from the past. However, it is alive and well, and it's important that everyone recognizes it. Here are some examples of redlining. Refuse to make a mortgage or refinance a mortgage loan. Refuse to provide information regarding loans. Impose different terms or conditions on a loan, such as different interest rates, points, or fees. Discriminate in appraising property. Oh, got to stop there, because just like steering, I went through that too. When I purchased my home, I didn't realize at first that I had paid for multiple appraisals. Fast forward years later, I had gotten a notice from a law firm indicating that I was one of millions of African-American women who had paid multiple times for appraisals, so I became a part of a class action suit. Next, refuse to purchase a loan or set different terms or conditions for purchasing a loan, and discriminate in providing other financial assistance or for purchasing, constructing, improving, repairing, or maintaining a dwelling, or other financial assistance secured by residential real estate. Next. From our friends at the Reveal for the Center for Investigative Reporting, they released an amazing story that got a lot of attention beginning in 2018. In fact, the two reporters whose names are listed at the bottom of the slide, Aaron Glantz and Emmanuel Martinez, they were able to uncover that there's a heck of a whole lot of modern day redlining going on in the United States. Aaron testified before Congress, and as a result of their investigative reporting, their stories, Kept Out Part 1 and 2, became finalists for Pulitzer prizes, and they won a Peabody for the reporting. And Aaron and I have become friends as a result of all of his work. And he wrote the book, Home Wreckers, and it's a really long title. It's very interesting. I read the book, and I have to tell you, gee whiz, you know, some things you're wiser for reading, but you're sadder at the same time. And I was sadder because it helped me to realize that people can be wired differently. Some of us are wired towards trying to achieve peace in this world, and we want to see equality and equity and all those nice things. And then others are just out for themselves. And in the book Home Wreckers, Aaron was able to outline how some people will take advantage of every good catastrophe, meaning for them it's good because they see the profit within the catastrophe. And my concern under COVID is that the same thing could happen by the time we find ourselves out of this humanitarian crisis. So under this year-long analysis, they combed through 31 million loan records from 2015 to 2016 and honed in on 6 million conventional home purchase loans. Out of 409 metro areas, it found applicants of color in 61 metro areas were likely to be denied conventional home purchase mortgage, even after controlling for 9 economic and social factors, including the applicant's income, amount of the loan, and the neighborhood where they wanted to buy property. Next. The analysis showed Black applicants consistently were turned away more often than whites in 48 metropolitan areas. That translates into Latinos in 25 metropolitan areas, Asians in 9 metropolitan areas, Native Americans in 3, and in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, Reveal found all 4 groups were significantly more likely to be denied a home loan than whites. However, We're talking about Philadelphia. So Reveal focused its story in Philadelphia because among the largest metro areas, it has one of the widest lending disparities. Prospective Black borrowers were almost 3 times more likely to be denied a conventional home purchase loan as white applicants. Next. So within the story, Aaron and Emmanuel were able to uncover that there's a loophole in the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act. So I have to talk for a moment about what that act is. So I look at the Fair Housing Act as the daddy and the Community Reinvestment Act as the son of anti-redlining laws in the United States. And our reporters or investigative reporters uncovered a cruel twist. Here, the law that was supposed to address redlining, fight blight, and improve conditions in communities of color. However, when you looked at gentrifying communities, banks were able to claim lending credit for lending to white newcomers, while people of color were denied and pushed out. So one group got favor over another. Next. Here is a review of the mortgage loans in the Point Breeze section of Philadelphia from 2012 to 2016. So according to the data required by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which was passed in 1975, 806 white applicants were granted loans and rejected 152 times. African-American applicants were granted 275 loans and were rejected 471 times. And the results presented fewer opportunities for African-Americans to purchase new properties and obtain home equity line of credit to repair their homes. I want to say something about that. Home equity line of credit is really important to homeowners because you're able to tap into your equity in order to send people to college, to make major repairs in your home, to do all sorts of things that you want to do. But if you can't access that home equity line of credit, my research has uncovered that many African Americans are being steered into reverse mortgage products, which might be okay for some people, but certainly not for all. And a report that came out in 2018 identified that Philadelphia became the #1 city in which African Americans, and you have to be a certain age in order to get the reverse mortgage, received a reverse mortgage and also foreclosed on their homes as a result of it, because there are conditions related to reverse mortgage that oftentimes people are unaware of. And if you've ever heard those commercials on television about reverse mortgage, it sounds so convincing, but it's not entirely true and it's not working for all people. Next. More about what the reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting uncovered, and that's that increasingly mortgage brokers are offering and granting home loans. In Philadelphia, there's been a dramatic growth of unregulated mortgage brokers. Mortgage brokers are not regulated by the Community Reinvestment Act. Therefore, they do not have the same requirements to lend to low to moderate income persons and in low to moderate income communities. The Community Reinvestment Act applies to banks with branches and have deposit requirements. And the new comptroller, and this is from 2018, so it's not that comptroller anymore, was committed to updating the Community Reinvestment Act, which they did, and met with the American Bankers Association, who complained of overly restrictive concepts of community and economic development under the Community Reinvestment Act, and rules should be loosened. I was one of thousands of people that submitted a comment letter during that period of open commenting regarding the new rules around the Community Reinvestment Act. And my greatest concern was that by loosening the rules, if you will, it was really taking away from the spirit and the letter of the anti-redlining law that was written in 1977 that absolutely had to be written. And if you think about all of those points on the timeline that I read going into the fair housing part of this presentation, I hope you understand why. Next. So what can we do to address redlining, segregation, and gentrification? Well, here are a few things. We can work with local housing counseling agencies. If you are somebody who is looking to become a first-time homeowner, or you just want to learn more about renting, go to your local housing counseling agency. That's what it's in place for. The housing counselors are there to help you learn an entire vocabulary that you may be unfamiliar with. That way, when you enter into the process of purchasing a home, you become an informed purchaser. Next, fix or improve credit rating. I want to stop right here and make a note, because you can fix and improve credit rating, but if you're going to interact with somebody who's going to discriminate against you, you can have the highest credit score and you can have great debt to income ratio. So if you're going to experience discrimination, you're going to experience it. But at least by fixing and improving credit rating, you create a great defense if you experience the discrimination. Increase knowledge and understanding of financial literacy and fair lending laws. You know, being an informed consumer is the best thing to become. And start or expand an economic development plan. You know, if you don't have one, start it. If you don't know how to start it, find somebody else that has already started one. Again, that's what your housing counseling agency may be able to assist you with, or there could be clubs that you can join. There's a ton of electronic resources that are available. People are creating apps all the time. Join the app. It's almost like learning a second language, and that is okay. I recognize that sometimes it can be a bit intimidating when you start to learn the terms, but the same thing happens when you're learning a new language. Just hang in there, because guess what? This whole system is built around capitalism. And if you don't become an informed consumer, you will be the bait. Advocate for new and important laws that are intended to produce equality and equity. For example, Philadelphia and the Commonwealth, meaning Pennsylvania, have considered implementing local and statewide community reinvestment acts. Push for that. I'm one of those voices that is pushing for that, insists that we have that kind of legislation in Pennsylvania and inside of Philadelphia, even if we can't get it at the level of the Commonwealth. If you believe that we need to have decent community reinvestment act, you know, on a local level practices, then push for that. For example, the city of Philadelphia, you know, has banks that it deposits its funds with, its payroll, its retirement, and other fees that it collects. Make sure that we're not depositing in institutions that routinely engage in discrimination or fair lending practices. Learn each political party's mission, goals, and objectives. Contact your local, state, and federal representatives. They need to hear from us. If they don't hear from us, they might think all is well. And that could be the absolute furthest from the truth. Let them know what's going on the ground. Sometimes you will be the only voice that they'll hear that will inform them about things that are happening that they were unaware of. So be that voice, and then get other people to be those voices as well. Start or participate in networks, coalitions, or associations that support voting and special interest activities, namely civil rights. You know, one of my pet peeves about housing is that if it doesn't have fair in front of it, then we somehow lose all of our interests around equity and equality. You know, we have to think of all housing in terms of achieving civil rights. So I don't know how we do that without me, you know, and others raising that as an issue. But I'm doing my best, and I hope that you join me in this fight so that the next time you hear somebody talk about housing in general, don't let them get away with only saying housing. You know, kind of push the envelope by asking, well, do you mean that it includes protected classes and that people, you know, who were historically disenfranchised are now going to be able to be on a level playing field? And then hold people and entities accountable for their actions by organizing, strategizing, mobilizing, and voting against discriminatory policies and practices. At the top of this presentation, we heard from Eric, and he mentioned that within affordable housing really is this deeper, nuanced conversation around fair housing, and it truly is. What's going on with the zoning ordinance, lead legislation, or any kind of legislation for that matter that can have an adverse effect on a protected class. You want to be mindful of that, and if it's something that's going to create harm, stop it immediately. You want to push back against discriminatory policies and practices because they cost our society in numerous ways. Not only does it create an eyesore, it creates pain inside of people's lives. And guess what? We're all going to pay for it one way or another. And then last but not least, file fair housing or fair lending complaints when discrimination occurs. Don't let people get away with it. And I do recognize that if you're dealing with racial battle fatigue or you're dealing with any other kind of fatigue related to your protection, you don't always have the strength to fight the fight. But if you don't, you won't stop it. If you don't, then it means it only goes on. We have to hold people accountable. And in some ways, it's an act of love, because what I have found in this experience is when I sit across the table from a respondent, most times they didn't realize that they were being so harmful to another human being. They're usually pretty contrite, and they're also interested in working with the organization to ameliorate the issue within their company. Next. Some of the effects of housing discrimination. Eric mentioned this at the top of the presentation. So I just want to go into some details. Mental health disorders, that can come out of it. People are sometimes traumatized or they're re-traumatized by housing discrimination. It might provoke anxiety or depression, or a combination of anxiety and depression. People can suffer from grief as a result of losing a home or losing an opportunity. Homelessness. In other words, living on the street, couch surfing, shelters, or staying in cars. We have people who are living in cars in different parts of Pennsylvania because of homelessness. And institutionalization. Sometimes that's overlooked, but it's really important to note that, people who are discriminated against can end up in hospitals or assisted living facilities. One of my worst days in fair housing was when I found out that a senior who had reserved housing through a program that will remain nameless right now, asked for reasonable accommodation to get her deposit back, because as opposed to her improving, her health declined, and she went from the hospital into assisted living. Well, from assisted living, unfortunately, we lost her. And that's not the only time that I've lost somebody in the course of this work. So institutionalization can be real for people. It can also appear in the form of behavioral health services that they'll need. And when they really spiral downward, it can end up as a form of incarceration. Health disparities like hypertension, diabetes, infections, direct responses to the stress that people undergo when they experience housing discrimination. Premature death. In other words, a shortened life expectancy when you live in certain neighborhoods that are contaminated because of the environment, or you're not around, you're not in an area where you can purchase decent food that will really feed your cells, feed your body so that you will have optimal health. Undereducation, in other words, underperforming schools, school closures. As far as I'm concerned, the massive school closures that we experienced in Philadelphia several years ago was a form of educational redlining. It contributes to the achievement gap that we hear people talking about. Segregation, or as Ruby Sales calls it, racial internment camps. People are put off into these racial internment camps, one group, another group, and so forth. And then economic deprivation, lower or no access to business and or financial products. How can people thrive in a capitalistic society if they have low or no access to business or financial products? And then we wonder why the next bullet appears, crime and violence. You know, there's a part of this that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you create a bad neighborhood, because neighborhoods are planned and they can be planned to be horrific. If you plan a horrific neighborhood, you can produce the outcome of increased law enforcement presence as well as murder rates. And then retail and food deserts, inadequate access to and far distance from nutritious foods. Mentioned that moments ago. Displacement due to gentrifying neighborhoods. So rising rents, overtaxation. There's an article that was written at the beginning of this month, I believe it was July 2nd, in the New York Times, that highlights how African-American communities are typically overtaxed. Yet when they try to sell their homes, they can't get the same amount of money compared to whites. And then cultural differences that may emerge. Okay, so fine, you have a cultural difference, but many times there's a need for human relation interventions in order for people to learn how to live together with those different cultures and cultural differences that emerge. And then, implicit and explicit biases, you know, the kind that are detrimental. And then the latest subprime lending practices, seems like we just can't get rid of the issue of subprime lending. Now, I know that according to lenders, there's a justification for that, but when you look at the outcomes, it's really hard to accept that. Here's an example of a really bad subprime lending practice. No income, no asset loans. That makes no sense. So don't take it. Stated income loans. You're going to take my word for it. No proof of it. Interest-only loans. Bridge loans, contract loans. We know that contract loans were one of the ways in which African Americans during the first and second waves of the Great Migration were able to purchase homes in different cities, including Philadelphia. But I tell you, one of the saddest commentaries about those contract loans is that anytime somebody missed one payment or was late with a payment, their entire investment was lost. Exposure to environmental hazards or you're at risk for cancer or other health threats and low property value as a result of that environmental hazard. And then I have at the very bottom, the ultimate achievement is to defeat the enemy without even coming to battle. Unfortunately, our disenfranchised, marginalized groups, and throughout this conversation, most of it has been about African Americans, even though it really does include all protections at this stage, have been so harmed that sometimes they don't even see it coming, which is really unfortunate. Next. There's a listing of authors. So those of you who are going to look at this presentation later, I encourage you to look at some of the authors that have researched and written about redlining and segregation. Next. If you believe that you are the victim of a fair housing or fair lending discrimination, then I encourage you to contact the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, Region 3. There's an office right here in Philadelphia. The number is 888-799-2085. You can also contact the Department of Justice if there's a pattern or practice of discrimination at 202-514-4609. You can contact the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General, Bureau of Consumer Protection at 800-441-2555. You can contact the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. There's a Harrisburg Regional Office, Philadelphia Regional Office, and a Pittsburgh Regional Office, and all the numbers are available. And then last but not least, you can contact the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania. Our office number is 215-625-0700. We are teleworking. And that means that when you call that number, the intake person's phone, computer will ring. Her computer will ring and she'll answer the computer. And if she's on another call, she will call you back. So trust the voicemail. She'll give you a call back. And we're available to help you file complaints. I will say that in order to file a complaint, you must have evidence. Sometimes people hand you the evidence because they'll make a direct statement or they'll hand you a document that has a discrimination in it. Other times they will not hand you the evidence. It will not be direct. So the organization may, and I want to underscore, highlight, and bolden, put quotation marks around, may be able to assist you in generating the evidence that you need in order to file a complaint. You know, another sad commentary is when we're not able to help people generate that evidence. That's unfortunate, but it does happen. I have to be honest with you. The last thing that I want to do is raise your expectation and not be able to meet those expectations. So the truth is sometimes we're not able to help when there's no way of getting evidence to prove that you were discriminated. It's a horrible thing that happens. And, you know, when it happens and it's very devastating to you, I encourage, you know, that you find people that you love or who love you, that you can talk to so that you can, you know, kind of help cleanse yourself of that toxic experience. And then you always have the option to file a lawsuit in federal court. There's a statute of limitations associated with each one of the agencies, with HUD, with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and with court. So if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to contact the organization at 215-625-0700. Next. Here's an example of a press release from the Fair Housing Rights Center. We were able to help someone who has a disability. She needed a specific parking space, not any parking space, but a specific parking space because of her medical condition and the quality of air which was affecting her health. Achieve social justice because we helped her get the parking space she needed. We helped her to make sure that people could not smoke near her unit. And she was compensated, not just because, she was compensated because she ended up spending a lot of money dealing with the discrimination. Next. Here's another example of a complaint of a survivor of domestic violence who ended up being victimized twice, first by her batterer and then by the housing provider. So she was compensated for the discrimination that she experienced. Next. That's it. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope that there are questions that I'm able to answer. So let's do this. Can't hear you.
First of all, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. We do have a few questions. Let's see. First one, how do you learn about banks' actual lending practices? Are there articles, books, documentaries that we can consume, or is it purely through an FOI request?
Good question. An FOI request is an option. However, you can go to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's website right now, and you can look at the numbers related to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So you can see the rate at which banks have been lending. That information is available. You may not have to go through the Financial Consumer Protection Bureau's website. You might be able to just Google it. You know how we can turn to a search engine nowadays and just type in 2018 and let's say, oh, I don't want to name a bank. I don't want to, I don't want to name a bank. You can fill in the blank yourself and type in that bank and look at what kind of information comes back related to its Home Mortgage Disclosure Act numbers. You can also, you know, just walk into a bank and ask, and if people get stiff about that, that should be an indicator right there of whether or not you want to do business with that bank.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As COVID-19, next question. As COVID-19 has continued to affect our country, mortgage moratoriums in some areas will not be held in place. Do you have any suggestions or resources for renters or homeowners who might be at risk of losing their housing because of COVID-19?
Put pressure on your elected officials. Now is not the time to be polite. You know, when we watched people pour into the street weeks ago and they stayed out there, they forced change. That's exactly what we need right now. And even though I am an advocate, I tell folk all the time, don't rely on me. I am one, you are many. Use your power. Put pressure on your elected officials. Call them. Send emails to them. If they're online sessions, participate in those sessions. Get a gang, well, a gang in a good way, of people together with you to put more pressure on them. Because again, if they don't hear from us, they're going to think all is well. Well, all is going to be well for people who haven't lost their jobs, people who have not succumbed to the virus, and who will not have long-term implications from it. But if you're somebody who's somehow been caught up in the snare of it, you have to push the envelope. You have to force this issue. If you need a longer moratorium, that is exactly what you asked for. So there is funding available through the CARES Act, but that's running out. What we're looking for now on the federal level is the HEROES Act. There's $100 billion that Congress has already passed towards rental assistance. And then I believe it's 75 billion for homeowners. So I repeat that, 100 billion for renters, 75 billion for homeowners. This already went through in May in Congress, but now we're waiting on the Senate. Put pressure on the Senate. That's what they're there for. Put pressure on them. We need it now. We need a hero right now, not later, right now, because I can only imagine how people are feeling if they're worried about when am I going to be able to pay my rent? And it's illegal for a landlord to put you out during a moratorium. I just want to mention that. You don't have to leave during a moratorium. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just to let you know, we have about 5 more questions.
Okay.
Do you find that more complaints, I'm assuming this is complaints to HUD, do you find more, or fair housing complaints, do you find more complaints come out of denial of mortgages or evictions from housing?
More complaints come out of evictions because, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to denial of mortgages, if we're talking about African Americans and even Hispanics for that matter, people don't complain to groups like me. They complain to their friends. They'll talk about it to their friends. And sometimes they don't want to talk about it with their friends. And I'll tell you why. They're embarrassed. They're thinking, when I was denied, it was a reflection of me. There's something insufficient about me. It's painful. It's like being rejected by somebody you kind of like, you know, you were looking at them, you thought they were looking back at you, you made the first move, and then they said, oops, no. And that's in some ways how people feel when they're denied loans. So yeah, more renters complain. And a lot of renters complain because of all sorts of things related to disability. You know, what looks like a little substance on the wall or on the ceiling. I'm talking about what people perceive as mold, and I can't call it mold unless it's tested, but suddenly they find themselves at the emergency room more often. They're having all sorts of respiratory problems. It is highly likely that it's mold. It's exacerbating their disability. That's very common for renters. It's also common when you have children with disabilities that need special provisions in the housing. So yeah, more renters end up complaining.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you most often give this presentation to? What groups do you talk to? And then what parts of this presentation do you share the most? I think you mentioned at one point during this that you kind of geared this one more towards redlining. And so who do you give this presentation to, and how do you adjust it based on your audience?
Every presentation is tailor-made on purpose because I'm speaking to diverse people and I want to be sure that their interest is being met. So if it's housing providers, if it's housing providers, then this entire presentation looks and sounds different because I want to make sure that they're complying with their fair housing requirements and obligations. If they are a consumer, I want to make sure that they understand their rights. So if they're a renter, I'm going to gear the conversation more towards issues related to renting. If they're trying to purchase a home, then I'm going to look more around sales and lending. So it really does depend. But the bottom line is understanding that there are 7 protections and different ways in which people can experience discrimination. And, you know, I really didn't go into what's called affirmatively furthering fair housing right now, but very quickly, that means that jurisdictions that receive federal funds have an obligation not to discriminate and to remove barriers of discrimination within their jurisdiction. So if they have underperforming schools, that's an issue. If they have a zoning law that prohibits, you know, families with children from living in certain districts, that's an issue. As far as I'm concerned, overtaxation, that's an issue. There's all sorts of things that jurisdictions can do to remove, you know, historical forms of discrimination because it's very likely that it's there.
Thanks. I have a quick question. I've been talking with my housemate a lot about dog whistle. They introduced me to this term of dog whistle politics, and you referenced it earlier in your presentation as well. And thinking specifically about redlining and how this is so glaring, it's so blatantly based on race. And I think when you were talking about, of course, historical redlining during the Roosevelt administration, but then also this newer form of modern redlining. Is there any dog whistle reasoning behind it? Or is it just like when they were redlining neighborhoods, was there any justification of what was a, I think it was hazardous and risky neighborhood besides race? Or was it just, did everybody understand like, oh, that's based on race?
You have to think about the climate during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. We just lived in a different climate. We know for a fact that public housing was originally created for working families. And then there came a period at which the federal government decided to subsidize housing developments and move people out of urban centers into the suburbs because we built highways. We had more cars and we had highways, and suddenly people could, you know, go out into those areas. And then we saw a lot more racial segregation because folks who had lived in projects were no longer in those projects because they were in suburban communities. And then more African Americans were able to move into those projects over time. And then we watched those neighborhoods become ghettoized. So we do know that there were dog whistles. I mentioned one earlier. There goes the neighborhood. You know, it's blockbusting was another example of reasons why people had to get out of neighborhoods. I understand that there were African Americans who were paid, women in particular, who were paid to take a stroller, a baby stroller, and walk on a block and go up and down the block to frighten the hell out of people so that they, seriously, so that they would then encourage folks who were living on the block to say, OMG, it's time to go. Yeah, there were a number of tactics that were used in order to try to move one group out so that another group could move in. And all of this has been for profit. Everything that I have talked about this evening, at the end of the day, has always been about profit. It's been about dehumanizing people. It's been about indignities, but it's also been about profit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
In regards to trailer home communities, interest rates and down payments for purchase are significantly higher and unjust, particularly for under-resourced and low-income families. So how does this fall into housing discrimination? And is there anything that can be done about it?
Honestly, I can't speak to that. I'm not as informed about that. That's something I would have to research, but I am aware that that happens. And I have had people over the years to contact me from those communities. Yeah, but to be able to speak right now, I'm reluctant to do so because I don't want to mislead anyone. I apologize.
That's okay. Thinking about this list of resources that you gave towards the end of the presentation with phone numbers for regional offices, does every state have similar offices? And are the federal HUD regions big or small? And how are they determined?
Okay, I believe there are 10 HUD regional offices. There are X number of states per region. Region 3 has 5 states, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and District of Washington, D.C. And in terms of an agency like the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania, go to HUD.gov's website, look under program offices, Fair Housing Equal Opportunity, and you can find an agency that's similar to the Fair Housing Rights Center in your own backyard. Most states have at least one, some have a few of agencies like the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania working to assist you. Listen, let HUD.gov become your new best friend. It should be bookmarked, part of your favorites. You know, the history should always be active, because think about it like this. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now let's just think about that for a few moments. Housing, which is so broad, and then urban development, which is also broad. So all things housing and urban development, you'll find on that website. So if there's a term in housing that you're unfamiliar with, they have all sorts of vocabulary lists there. There's glossaries where you can look up things. You can look at the history of things. You can look at what's happening right now. There's all sorts of twists and turns related to housing, and it's all there on HUD's website. So I encourage everybody to bookmark HUD.gov, look at it periodically so that you can remain abreast of what's happening in terms of housing and urban development in our country.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Last question.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how reasonable accommodations work, for instance, if somebody lives in a multi-story apartment building and then develops a disability for which they need an elevator, and there isn't already one in the building, how would that work? Who would pay for it? And are there exceptions for historic or older buildings?
Okay, so there was a lot right in there. Let's break that down. So let's start with the first part. If they're in a multi-story building and they develop a disability and can no longer, I guess, use stairs, but okay, it's very unlikely that the owner is going to install an elevator. Yeah. But you can be creative. You can think about a stair lift. You can ask if there is a unit available on the first floor to move to that unit on the first floor. Think outside of the box, because an elevator is extremely expensive and perhaps unlikely, but you know, there are other ways of achieving the same end. The next part, there was something else that you mentioned.
Who would pay for it?
Okay, so when it comes to modifications, so we're talking about a modification right now. If the housing provider receives any federal assistance excluding Section 8, then the housing provider would pay for the modification. If the housing provider does not receive any federal assistance, then the occupant would pay for the modification.
So then last part of that question, are there exceptions for historic or older buildings?
Well, exceptions for, I can't imagine why a historic or older building would not have to still make an accommodation for someone who makes the request, as long as it's not an administrative burden and financial. An undue financial burden. So it has to be administrative and financial, or the request has to alter the nature of the service. If that's not happening, and a person has provided proof from their doctor or person who's in a position to know that there is a need for a modification, then you know it's very likely that the modification should be made. I understand that maybe a housing provider would want to modify a historic building, but you know, housing providers, you have to think about it like this. How much bad public relations do you really want to generate for yourself?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes it kind of boils down to that. And I don't mean, you know, to seem insensitive, because I realize that, you know, what most of us do for a living is our passion. It's what we pour ourselves into. But if you care that much more about buildings and people, oh, maybe being a housing provider is not the right service that you want to be in. You really do have to think about that. Because if somebody makes a request, you deny it because you're siding more with, I want to protect my property than address their actual need. They have the right to file a complaint against you. And if the complaint is jurisdictional, if it's filed at HUD or let's say the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, or if it goes before a court, you could pay dearly for the decision that you wanted to protect the property more so than grant the individual the request. Think about it like this. Reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications were given to us because of the need to level the playing field for people with disabilities. And if you don't have a disability today, it could happen tomorrow. It could happen as a result of injury, as a result of aging, all sorts of, it might not be you, it could be somebody you love that could change your whole perspective about reasonable accommodations and modifications, because suddenly something that seemed to be so distant to you is now personal.
Great. Well, that was our last question.
Okay.
Thank you so much. You mentioned passion a minute ago. Your passion for fair housing and the work that you do is so clear. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight, sharing your knowledge with us. I think this presentation was fantastic. The historical context plus the combination of what you're doing now. It was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody listening right now feels the same way. So turning to the folks that attended, just want to say if you enjoyed what you heard tonight, please, we ask that you consider donating to the Fair Housing Rights Center or to Bike and Build. And Angela, thank you. Thanks to everybody who came. And then we hope to see you next week when we talk about rural affordable housing with Carolyn Dunn, the Executive Director of Stafford County Economic Development, when Carolyn will talk to us about affordable housing in a much different context in her rural community of St. John, Kansas. So
thank you. Thank you for the platform, and thank you to all who are saying thank you. Thank you very much as well. Take care, everybody. Be safe. Stay well.
Good night, everyone.